Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
The United States has been, since the post-World War II period, in other words, since the Bretton Woods system in 1944, until today, and it will continue to be in the foreseeable future, as a core country in the capitalist world system, the nucleus for the next economic recession, contraction. So what we have is a situation where the United States, which constitutes roughly 14 to 15% of GDP in terms of world share in purchasing power parity versus China's 20%, the United States, although 5%, roughly a little bit more than 5%, less than China's share of global GDP, will still be at the center of the next global recession, economic contraction. And there are many reasons for this. Part of it is that indeed the United States, leading the G7 group, which, by the way, has a lower GDP even in nominal value, not just in purchasing power parity, especially after the latest statistics were published that China's GDP, the latest figures are, in purchasing power parity are $12 trillion higher than the US. Putting that aside, the BRICS group as an entity has a higher GDP in both purchasing power parity and nominal value than the G7. Yet the next economic contraction nucleus will not be the China-led BRICS group. It will be the United States G7-led group. And there are many reasons for this. It is true that capitalism is a world system. Capitalism is international, and the BRICS economies are integrated very thoroughly, politics aside, with the G7. In fact, they feed on each other. And so that's one issue. The next issue, that the 500-year history of the political economy of capitalism, and even in its neoliberal phase in the last 50 years, has demonstrated that the capitalist economy on a world scale expands and contracts. It will not be, that's not going to stop. That will continue. The question of why is the United States at the center is interesting insofar as the United States is in a phase right now, and it has been in the last 15 years or so, in a transition, maybe more than 15, 20 years, since the 2008 global recession. It is in a transition phase, yielding to China as the world's preeminent economic power, the world's factory, if you will, the world's number one trading partner. So the question is, why still will we have the US as the nucleus for the next economic contraction? One reason is the policies of the United States, the self-destructive policies of the United States that will hasten the next economic contraction. This does not mean that the United States policies are responsible for the laws of how capitalism works. However, they are responsible for either mitigating the impact of economic contraction or making it worse and hastening it, bringing it about faster. And this is where we are today. Bring it about faster for a number of reasons related to one very important issue, which is the efforts on the part of the US government, bipartisan effort. It has nothing to do necessarily with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Both aim at the same goal, not yielding to China as the future economic global hegemon, the dominant country economically in the world. Therefore, imposing containment policy on China, economic containment as well as geopolitical containment, self-defeating policies, extremely costly and backfiring, and driving the United States, as we have seen in 2025 until this day. We're toward the end of February now. Today is the 21st of February of 2026. The United States having found itself in the odd position of regarding the entire world as its satellite, there to be feeding the US economy, which is on a decline, has been. This is a chronic state of affairs. This is not something that was created yesterday, has been on the decline. And so the United States under Trump has found the tool of economic nationalism to repair the damage and prevent the eventuality of playing second fiddle to China. On February 20th, today is the 21st, the US Supreme Court ruled by a vote of 6-3, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, that the tariffs Trump has been imposing since day one, January 20th, 2025, are not constitutional. For a very simple reason, because the Supreme Court, like many economists and businesses and political observers, economic observers, and so forth, analysts, view tariffs as a tax on American citizens, and only Congress, not the executive branch, has the power to tax the American people, not the executive branch. This is interesting because the Supreme Court historically, especially during the first Trump administration, as well as the second Trump administration, but even under Democrat administrations, the Supreme Court has actually yielded on the unitary executive theory. This is a theory which actually permits the executive branch to usurp powers belonging to the legislative branch, which, according to the Constitution, is obviously more representative of the American people. It's a very important issue here. Now, the Supreme Court, of course, decision has far-reaching implications, because what we're looking at is between 170 and 200 billion that has in tariffs that somehow have to be adjusted for. That the president was asked that question. Of course, the only thing he did is he castigated the justices who voted against tariffs and praised the 3 who voted with him to continue the tariffs. The other thing is that the Trump administration, from the president on down, had been promising the American people that tariffs had yielded hundreds of billions in revenue and hundreds of billions, if not trillions, in economic benefits, despite studies by the Joint Economic Committee based in Washington, D.C., hardly a bipartisan group, hardly an institution that is pro-China or pro-excess of evil or anti-US, as well as J.P. Morgan, the world's largest bank, 2 independent studies. Both of them showed that tariffs have been detrimental to the economy. specifically to small business and the mass consumer. And the Joint Economic Committee study actually goes into more detail and points out that the tariffs, and this is where this study ties in, and this is why I'm using it as empirical evidence of the economy of crisis in the United States. It hastens the economic contraction, which is inevitable. It would happen. It would happen. It will happen at one point or another. Nobody knows when, but it will happen. But what the study found is that 166,000 blue collar jobs alone were lost when the Trump administration was promising hundreds of thousands of jobs to be gained because of reshoring. That is, manufacturing companies, both foreign and domestic, coming back to the United States and creating those high paying manufacturing jobs. Well, according to the Joint Economic Committee Policy Group, 166,000 jobs, blue collar minus the white collar, alone were lost, not gained. So what we have here, the JP Morgan study, by the way, just as a sideline here, the JP Morgan study really focused on small businesses. And small businesses in America, historically, by the way, from the 19th century to the present, have been very important in stimulating economic growth. Obviously, all the focus is on the Dow 30 and the S&P 500, the big companies. However, small businesses are very important to the American economy and to the concept of the American Jeffersonian democracy, the small business person, the small business, the small farmer, and so forth. The JP Morgan study found that the tariffs have been detrimental precisely given the bank here, the JP Morgan bank, concluded that we look at the empirical evidence from the bankruptcy filings, and they indicate a crisis in small businesses and even in the weaker chains, whether it's in the retail sector, selling products, or small restaurants and so forth. So this is a major issue. Now, this is all as a result of policy hastening economic contraction. Now, what does the president do? Doesn't take the time to reflect on this, to bring together some people and to sit down and talk about what is the next step, constructive step, to in fact provide the American people and business community and everybody else, the mass consumer as well, the working class and the middle class, with a vision that is constructive to turn the economy around, given the reports by both the Joint Economic Committee as well as JP Morgan and the decision of the Supreme Court. What was the response? The president announced at 10%, we don't know if this is going to take place, but he announced immediately, out of anger perhaps, certainly not policy, any reflection on public policy, 10% tariff on everybody, the entire world. It's the US versus the world. This is not just China, not just the enemies of the United States, whoever they are out there, and there are many, not just the Europeans, not playing fair, but the world, everybody, regardless of whether they have a trade surplus or with the United States, or they have a trade deficit with the United States. Punish them. Obviously, this is the sort of thing that rattles the markets. It creates instability. One of the reasons that scholarly studies, and I'm of the same school here, and I have been arguing this for years, point to the reality of an American crisis economy. The American crisis economy is a fact, and we look at this we look to substantiate this by looking at GDP growth rates in the US led G7 from 1990 to 2025. And what we see is that if we eliminate primarily China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, if we take those countries out of the equation, BRICS countries, by the way, today, we take them out, in the last 35 years, we don't have much of a global GDP growth because the US-led G7, because the transatlantic countries did not generate a lot of growth in the last 35 years. In fact, they have been, Japan included, by the way, Japan included in this. In fact, Japan among the lowest growth rates on the planet as far as a developing country, as a developed country, sorry, not developing, but developed country. So what we have is a serious structural problem, and the US with an economy in nominal value, largest in the world, not in purchasing power parity value, but in nominal value, leading the pack under corporate welfare, in other words, neoliberal policies, with policies intended to deregulate the markets, let a process known within the neoliberal political economy as financialization, which is parasitic, define economic growth on the basis of stock market performance rather than real economic growth in the primary sector of production, which is agriculture, mining, forestry, fisheries, as well as the secondary sector of production, manufacturing, and of course the tertiary sector, the service sector. They define it on the quarterly reports of the stock market. It just so happens that from the crash of 29, you can go back to the 1890s, sorry, the 1890s, 1920s, 1990s, 2000s, early 2000s, and now today, early 2020s, and you can see that there was a divergence between where the stock market was headed, going up, versus the real economy headed down. But when you measure only the stock market indicators, not the real economic indicators, you have a problem. And now one could argue, well, the only thing that matters is who makes money on the market. Okay, that's fine, except that statistics show, government statistics, only a small percentage of the American people, less than 5%, are the heavy hitters, the heavy owners in the market. They are fine. The rest of the population, especially the bottom 3/4, are not. They are in what I call, I wrote an article about this a number of years ago. They are experiencing the new normal in a crisis economy, which is stagnation under the neoliberal model. Because let's face it, no matter whether you've studied economics or you read the newspaper, whether it's establishment newspapers, business newspapers like the Wall Street Journal or any other newspaper today, and you look at the signs for economic contraction, basically it boils down to a couple of things. Okay, jobs. Look at jobs growth, and then especially structural unemployment, real unemployment, by the way, not the numbers officially given. In other words, you have to go to AFL-CIO numbers to get some real numbers, and as well as structural underemployment, which is seasonal employment, part-time work, and that's a very important indicator. Okay, you have to look at that. where is the jobs growth headed? You have to look at the issue of consumption. Where is mass consumption headed? And then you look at debt, household debt. When you look at those indicators, they more or less point you, and then consumer sentiment, of course, is what businesses use, especially stock market analysts. You look at that, and it points to economic contraction. And that is where we're at today. But the issue is not, like I said, it is not that capitalism will contract and it will expand. That it's been doing that for 500 years. The more serious issue is that this is happening. It just so happens that we're in a period in history where there is a transition in the core of the world system from the US-led G7 to the China-led BRICS group. And this transition is resisted by the United States at the core, the Pax Americana era coming to an end, and the United States doing everything it can to destabilize that transition instead of going along to manage, as Xi Jinping and China have advised, to better manage this for the benefit of all and not to the detriment of all. So this is where we are today. And I do want to point out a recent study by the World Bank, which indicates, by the way, that as well as a study by the World Economic Forum in Geneva, two studies actually, come to think of it. Both studies indicate that across the world, economic analysts, financial experts, world leaders do not see how we escape economic contraction at some point in this in the balance of this decade, in the next 5 years, coming up on the anniversary of the Great Depression of 1929, by the way. And they are even less optimistic what happens in the next 10 years. And when you look at the World Bank and the World Economic Forum reports, what you're struck with is that the problems are with the US-led West. They are not with the China-led BRICS group. And yet, the US-led led West is the one trying to undermine the only engine that actually was there that to help stimulate global economic growth in 2008. So this is the absurdity of economic policy. And the question is why? Why pursue self-defeating policies? Because a few people make money. The same Epstein file elite involved in all sorts of illegal activities, from human trafficking, child sex porn trafficking, and to financial and espionage acts. This same group is involved in influencing policy and conducting policy and making money. That is the tragedy of all this, that the very people involved, according to published reports in the Epstein group, some of those same people are influencing policy and making policy. And the question is, for whose benefit? The only thing that matters here is to ask the question, who benefits and who is harmed? And in the last analysis, that's the only thing that matters, because the people who are harmed are the bottom 3/4 of the population, and not just in the United States, but across the world, because there's only one world economy. It's the capitalist world economy. And no matter how much China-led BRICS group countries try to circumvent, and they are trying to establish their own hard currency. China is resisting using the yuan, its own national currency. It wants a BRICS group currency so that it doesn't disrupt its trade flow on a world scale. That's another matter. They're trying to circumvent. They're trying to establish their own supply channels, trade supply channels. They're trying to circumvent the U.S. Sanctions and tariffs. They're trying to do all sorts of things. The U.S. efforts of reshoring and friendshoring to basically circumvent economic nationalism and sanctions and tariffs by the United States. So that's the reality. That's what has been happening, and it will continue, by the way. Unfortunately, it will continue. And this is not necessarily to the detriment of the BRICS-led group, because when we look at where the growth is coming from, based on the World Bank report, in the next 5 years, it's not coming from the US-led G7. It's coming from the China-led BRICS group. There is not much growth. In fact, it averages around 1.2% in the G7 versus close to 3.8, something like that, close just under 4% on the other side. And if Russia were not in that, and Russia, of course, has been in a war with Ukraine, it would be a lot higher, by the way. But India and China, in other words, lead that pack, the BRICS group. So when you look at, and the World Bank, by the way, is hard. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C. It's hardly an institution that is exclusively loyal to Beijing. So what you have here, and the World Economic Forum in Geneva, the same thing. You have basically empirical studies that indicate that on the basis of where we have been in the last 10, 15 years, and the economic indicators, what we have is a situation where we're not looking to the West for much growth. We're looking for the trend that has been a reality for 35 years, from 1990, from Bush the Elder, in other words, that's who was president back then, to the present, to Trump. And we haven't seen much growth. We have seen stagnation. Yet, during that same period, the stagnation issue, that stagnation in GDP is reflected only in working class wages and lower middle class salaries. It's not reflected in the massive capital accumulation on the part of the richest 5%, especially what Senator Sanders calls the 1% oligarchy. It's not reflected there because when you look at the percent of rise in their wealth accumulation, it's astounding. While there is stagnation in working class and middle class wages and salaries, there has been an astounding growth in capital accumulation for the top of the hierarchy. And that hierarchy is who makes policy. So it's no accident that hierarchy advises both Democrats. By the way, Democrats are deep into this again, as a number of progressive Democrat senators and congressmen point out. They realize that they are yielding to policy of the lobbies, the corporate lobbies. They cater to Wall Street, and Wall Street measures wealth in terms of the financialization model. That is how much, that's, by the way, that's speculation. Let me just add something to this. Financialization model has come to the point to this day under this administration, the Trump administration, where cryptocurrency, which is high risk and high crime because more and more reports globally are published about the illegal activities involving cryptocurrency and the high risk involving cryptocurrency. And yet, everyone in the U.S. Justice Department, I believe in congressional testimony, if I recall, the number was there were 40 people, lawyers basically, involved in monitoring what the crypto sector was doing. They were all dismissed. That is because the first family in the White House itself is very deep into cryptocurrency. Administration officials are big investors in cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is nothing but speculation. It sells nothing. It is about nothing. When you invest in McDonald's, you're investing in what McDonald's sells, although the stock market, the price reflects also a lot of speculation. It's the same thing with a pharmaceutical company, the same thing with when you invest with JP Morgan, a banking company. So when you invest in crypto, it's really literally investing in absolutely nothing. One could argue that a piece of paper, namely the dollar, it's just a piece of paper, is also nothing. It's just paper, except that the dollar represents the value of the gross value of the economy, total products and services of the economy. Crypto is purely speculation. And yet there were attempts made through policy to integrate it into the monetary system, making the economy even more risky and hastening the next global economic contraction and adding another layer to what I call the crisis US economy, which is permanent, by the way. And the question, of course, is who's going to pay for this in the end, other than laid off workers, other than even lower living standards for the bottom 50%, especially the bottom 50% of the population. And I'll give you some statistics later on household debt and US poverty and so forth. The signs of recession, there are many reports that have been published. By the way, let me make something very clear. Nobody can predict when. Nobody can time. There are a lot of reports in business journal. So-and-so predicted exactly when a recession. Okay, they did. It happened to be an accident. No one knows because anything can happen. A war can break out, for example. Some strange policy, that's major shift can be promulgated that changes the equation. So market equilibrium can be upset by any number of factors. So it is really very difficult to predict when a recession, but it will take place. The question is, why take steps which will lead to a recession just for short-term profit of certain people, including those in the political class, by the way, including those in government, and a circle of an elite circle that administration, that group serves. And this is for both political parties. Let me point to something that is true about the new realities of economic contractions, by the way, that is that people usually don't think of it in these terms. The concept of a crisis U.S. economy. The fact is that there is no crisis U.S. economy for the richest 7% whose net worth is over $1 million in the United States. They're fine. And then if you add another 20%, which is that middle group below them, they're fine too. For the rest of the population, the bottom 3/4 of the population, according to statistics, many of them, 60 to 70% of them at least, living paycheck to paycheck, they are in a crisis economy. Living paycheck to paycheck is a crisis economy. Then you have within that group a large percentage who spend an inordinate amount of their earnings for essentials. Essentials are food and medicine, and of course, housing. And then there is the reality of the ever rising, rapidly rising uh, cost of a college. The reason college education has been important historically in America and in the world, by the way, because it has been a tool for upward social mobility. We don't see much upward social mobility, as Senator Bernie Sanders, among others, have pointed out. One reason for this is because a college degree today, a bachelor's degree today, is equivalent to a high school degree in the 1960s. So we don't have the upward social mobility with a college degree, but even that has become very expensive because education, public education, forget about private colleges, but public education, public higher education has become as expensive today as private college education in the 1970s. So it's out of reach for a lot of people. Now, there are signs of a permanent recession, and the permanent recession is indeed a reality for the bottom three-fourths, and especially the bottom 50% of the population. We see this because the government keeps statistics on household debt, on college student debt, on credit card debt, on default of payments in credit cards as well as mortgages. All of these statistics point to a crisis. And one of the reasons that mainstream economists, not critics of the system like me, but mainstream economists point to the reality that we have a problem because debt is rising and defaults are rising. The default, the ability to pay, when one doesn't have the ability to pay, and more and more people are not paying. This signals an alarm bell right there. We also have the three main sectors of the U.S. economy, but Western economy as well, and it filters down to the rest of the world, namely the healthcare system. It is no secret the U.S. has the most expensive healthcare system, getting more expensive in the world, by the way, in terms of especially the developed countries. When you look at the United States healthcare system, it is not ranked as the world's number one healthcare system, and yet it's the most expensive in the world. And the inflation rate in this sector, health, which is very big, survival, very basic, very expensive, and getting more expensive, unaffordable for many people. And we have the reality of millions of people who are without any health insurance, and millions of people who have insurance, but they cannot afford the co-payment for the drug, the medications they need. So it's a choice between food or medicine for many of them. That's one issue, the healthcare system crisis. That's a permanent crisis. That's part of the overall US economy crisis. The other is housing, unaffordable. One reason that a progressive mayor won in New York City, Zoran Mamdani, calling himself a democratic socialist, is because unaffordable housing in New York, it's not New York, it's major cities throughout the United States, from Boston to San Francisco to Honolulu, unaffordable housing. So that's another issue. Rents and the cost of housing is out of reach for the average American. And the last issue, of course, is education, the catalyst to upward social mobility, as I said, not just in America, but across the world. So these are all signs. And when you look at those three signs and you have the convergence of that, And then you have major institutions like the Washington, D.C. based policy group, which comes out and says, by the way, jobs were lost, not gained, as the Trump administration points out. In 2025, both blue collar and white collar, and you have very slow jobs growth in the United States, despite the fictitious unemployment rate of around 4.2, 4.3%, by the way, which is twice that according to FLCIO. You have high unemployment, high structural unemployment in the United States, because you have to look at also the underemployment, seasonal and part-time employment rising, by the way. That's an important consideration. When you have the convergence of that, you have a problem. And it signals that the economic contraction is going to be very difficult. And one of the reasons it's going to be difficult is China, which helped to stimulate economic growth in the US and in major countries around the world in 2008, by the way, buying the treasuries of the United States and buying bonds, government bonds from other countries, major countries. Basically, they didn't do it because they're nice. They did it because they wanted to sell them products, so they had to provide the stimulus in stabilizing their currencies in order to sell them manufactured products. They did it to stimulate their own trade, so they can have stabilize employment. They followed Keynesian policies, which the U.S.-led G7 are against and have been undermining. In other words, with a neoliberal political economy and financialization. This is exactly, China is doing exactly the opposite of what the U.S.-led G7 have been doing. This is one reason we have a hastening of the next economic contraction. Now, the other issue, of course, is the structural stuff, which is very important. One of the policy decisions that has been made under neoliberal governments from Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s and then Reagan in the 1980s until today, Trump, is the trademark of a neoliberal is deregulation, deregulation, deregulation. Deregulating the economy is what got the hastened the recession of the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, the internet bubble of the late 1990s, the subprime problems of the 2008 after Lehman Brothers in 2007, the 2008 deep recession, which spread globally, deregulation. Now, that was addressed by some half-hearted measures, not real rigorous measures of re-regulating, providing a safety net so that they don't find themselves in the same situation. However, from Obama to Trump, and especially under Trump in the first administration when he won in 2016, to Biden, to Trump again now, deregulation is back in full force. And deregulation means high-risk ventures, risking money in speculation. And we have seen this. I'm just going to mention a couple of sectors because they have been in business headlines, but in average media headlines, period. One is artificial intelligence. Let me say a couple of words about artificial intelligence. The US especially, but many countries around the world, as in the Western world, have been banking on artificial intelligence as the techno fix, supposedly to fix all problems that are wrong with the neoliberal model, which is bankrupt itself, by the way. The neoliberal model contains so many contradictions. It's been in decline since the late 1990s, since the internet bubble of the 90s. It proved itself destructive in the 2008 global recession. And to this day, yet, we have people who believe that deregulation is the way to go. And yet, all of this will be fixed by the artificial intelligence uh, investments. Recently, in the last few weeks, trillions flowed out of artificial intelligence stocks, were lost in paper. People got out. And the reason is there was so much speculation in artificial intelligence that you would have to have near perfect conditions. And artificial intelligence, let's be honest about this, by the way, really means replacing the labor intensive sector in the economy with a capital intensive sector, investing in the machine and getting rid of the human. What do we do with the humans? According to studies that have been done all over the world, hundreds of millions will be replaced around the world. There have been many studies, especially the European Union. The European Union takes it a little bit more seriously than the United States. The United States doesn't take it seriously. This is a very serious issue. What does one do with the surplus labor force, the redundant labor force that will be replaced? What happens to these people? Will they be sinking into to use a 19th century term, the lumpen proletariat, the underclass that that will be roaming the streets, working as day laborers, stealing, committing crimes, according to, of course, the conventional view. In other words, will the political economy create a massive lumpen proletariat, a massive underclass? Well, the financialization model is on its way to creating such a large lumpen proletariat class. And yet the financialization model has proved itself replete with contradictions, because investors themselves realized all the speculation was hype. So they began taking money out of it. This exact same thing with crypto. Crypto reached the limits. It went sky high, and then, of course, it started coming down. No matter the efforts by the US government to legitimize it and to somehow equate cryptocurrency with the hard currency that is accepted globally. And they have found ways to put it into, to weave it into the Treasury Department and give it that legitimacy, make it part of the monetary system, creating an even greater risk. In other words, making the financialization model an integral part of the mainstream economy from which there is no salvation. And China, or anyone, but China, of course, is the world's largest economy, down the road is not going to be able to save the United States from a mega disaster of such speculation, because the level of speculation is immense when injected with trillions in cryptocurrency that represents absolutely nothing. Now, so deregulation, which is an integral part of financialization, because financialization needs deregulation, leads to what a former Federal Reserve Bank governor called, the president, the chair of the Federal Reserve called irrational exuberance. This irrational exuberance is going to lead into serious problems. And the World Economic Forum survey of 2025-26 indicates that indeed what we have is world leaders and financial experts around the globe that agree that all of this um, is signaling the next 5 to 10 years of stagnant, very slow growth. And most of that, as I pointed out, coming from the G7 led group, hovering around 1, 1.3, 1.2, 1.3%. That's very low growth. That's stagnation, by the way. Now, the question is, of course, what do the American people believe about all of this? How does the American public view all of this? When you look, and I want to devote the last segment of this session to public opinion polls and the perception of the American people on the US crisis economy and the fragmentation of the world economy because of tariffs, because the regional blocs, in other words, that have emerged, the BRICS-led group, the China-led BRICS group, rather, sorry, versus the US G7, and the fragmentation of the world economy, which undermines globalization and the neoliberal model, another contradiction. What public opinion polls show clearly is if President Donald Trump is unpopular today, he's unpopular primarily because the American people don't believe he's done a good job with the economy. It's very simple. The economy is at the top of the list. It's not necessarily his foreign policy, which in my view has been a disaster, chaotic, destabilizing, and hasn't provided anything constructive. A lot of promises, nothing. The question is, where are the results? We have to look at the results. Now, there is a lot of cynicism, and it's indicated in a public opinion poll where 69% of the American people do not believe that they can achieve the American dream, very popular in the 1950s and 1960s. In the immediate post-war period, the next 20 years after World War II, after World War II ended, the American dream was basically very simple. Upward social mobility, affording a house, having a good job, affording a house, making sure that the children go to college so they can move into the middle class or upper middle class. When you have 69% who don't believe that the American dream is achievable, they believe it's a myth, and it's not part of the social contract, that is a problem. When people stop believing in the promises of their own government, regardless of political party, by the way, this is 69% of the population. They're not all Republicans, they're not all Democrats or progressives or one party or the other. Another poll indicates that 60 to 70% of the population, I pointed this out before, live paycheck to paycheck, and 25% of the entire population cannot afford essentials in daily life. This is a real problem. 25% of the American people cannot afford essentials in daily life, and 12% of the American people are living below poverty line. The average household debt, making matters worse, and one of the reasons for the crisis economy in the US, stands at 106,000. This is at an all-time high in terms of real dollars in modern history, in modern American history. Credit card debt, consumer debt, bankruptcies, all of these things are college debt. All of these things are alarming. And at the same time, the US government has a public debt approaching 40 trillion. At a time that its GDP growth doesn't permit the US to be paying this out so that it doesn't undermine the value of the currency, which means inflationary conditions down the road. So what we have is a prescription for disaster, and then we add the policy of military Keynesianism. Let me explain briefly what that means. The US spends more money, more taxpayer money on its defense sector than any other country in the world. Okay. It is also dragging its allies to do the same, from Japan to Europe. So they're diverting assets from the civilian economy to the defense sector. That too undermines living standards, and it undermines a civilian economy growth, because China is narrowly focused on the issue of civilian economic growth and social development. The US is not interested in social development at all. It is cutting, it has been cutting for the last 40 years social development spending. It is cutting the social safety net. Okay. So what we have in the United States is a policy that undercuts mass consumption and a jobs growth economy, and then a government policy that defaults all of these structural problems to the enemy outside the United States that is competitive, namely China and the BRICS-led group. It's their fault. Now, China did not, is not responsible. It's responsible for a lot of things, but it's not responsible for the US Supreme Court decision on tariffs, for example, nor is it responsible. Here was an opportunity, by the way, for President and his group to come out and say, okay, we're going to take a look at this. We're going to follow a new course and perhaps do something to stimulate economic growth and bring about market equilibrium and greater prosperity for most Americans, at least, not all, okay, most Americans. They didn't do that. More and worse of the same was the answer. China didn't ask them. China had nothing to do with that. These are internal decisions. The Epstein elite, the Epstein file elite, many of them in government and on Wall Street, by the way, this is public information, they are the ones influencing and conducting policy. This is not the group that represents the social contract. This is not the group that represents the American people. This is not a group interested in democracy. This is not the group interested in popular sovereignty. This is the group interested in itself. Individuals interested in themselves, basically in amassing greater wealth at the expense of society, because corporate welfare means that society subsidizes this. Subsidies have increased, draining resources from the civilian economy, adding to the public debt and hastening the crisis economy. I'm going to leave it there. I thank you for listening. I ask you to join this channel and please write comments and ask questions. Thank you very much.